Hello, everyone. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk about drugs and alcohol and all these scams about doing drugs. I grew up in a family that I grew up when I grew up. I actually grew up in a family that had people that did drugs, not the illegal kind. I mean, just regular drugs like alcohol, cigarettes, and weed. And not that many people. I grew up in a Christian family, so we didn't have that many people, but just enough for you to know that it happens. You know. But what I realized as I grew up, not only did I grow up around people, family members that did drugs. Like throughout my entire life, man, everywhere I've worked, there are always people that did drugs. Just look around you. Most people you meet, are alcoholics or drug addicts or cigarette smokers. You're more likely to meet a cigarette smoker probably than an alcoholic, but almost everyone, drinks. It's normal in the U.S., in the United States, to drink some form of alcohol during parties, or during events, which is kind of weird. But what I realize is that these drugs, I don't really believe they have any real. I believe these things are placebo effects, man. I've never really. The only drug I've ever done was drink alcohol. And I'm not even someone who drinks alcohol a lot. Once in a while, like once every few years, of a friend guilt trips me into drinking alcohol. I take a sip and move on with my life. That's all. I'm not someone who even drinks alcohol at all. I don't buy, when I go to the store, I don't go anywhere near alcohol. And it's been years since I haven't since I haven't tasted a single, alcohol. Years. And, I'm not someone who drinks who drinks alcohol in any way, shape, or form. I don't like it. But what I realize is there's so many people out there trying to trick you into thinking that these drugs, somehow give you some sort of high. My entire life, is me watching, movies and TV shows and music videos of musicians constantly telling you that, these things give you some sort of high, you get high, and growing up, getting, what do you call it? Secondhand smoked, inhaling secondhand smoke, from alcohol, from what do you call it? From weed and cigarettes. I have to tell you, man, I did not get a single high, a feeling of high whatsoever. Even drinking alcohol doesn't give you any high. But yeah, you see all these alcoholics constantly telling you that, alcohol does this, it does that, it does that. And I have to tell you the truth, I don't see it anywhere, man. I've drank alcohol a few times, and I can probably count the number of times I drank alcohol, with my two hands, It's less than 10 times, man. And I'm in my 30s, and it's less than 10. 30 years old, and it's less than 10. That should tell you how little I drink, alcohol. I'd rather just stay away from drugs in general. It's not really due to religious reasons, just because these things, I'm not someone who falls for, scams or hype, man. No matter how many times you tell me that this thing is good for you, this thing gets you high. When I smell that secondhand smoke from your cigarettes, right? You tell me that cigarettes get you high. Oh, this gets you high, gets you high. When I smell that secondhand smoke from your cigarettes, I used to work at a place that almost everybody there smoked cigarettes, man. If they're not smoking cigarettes, during break, during our break time, they're chewing tobacco. They're swallowing, mouthfuls upon mouthfuls of tobacco and just chewing it down. So I've been around, alcohol, drug addicts my entire life, man. And I have to tell you, man, when they puff out that huge puff of cigarettes in your face, man, while you guys are having a conversation, when they puff out that huge puff of cigarettes in my face, man, I did not get a single feeling of high from it whatsoever. Instead, I feel I feel jittery and uncomfortable. My body starts to feel sick. Is that the feeling of, is that the high that they're talking about? It happens with marijuana as well. I've been with, now that marijuana has been legalized, man. There's there's so many people around that just puff it all over your face, man. Even before it was legalized, I've had people, doing it behind the scenes, and not once did I smell this, the smell of marijuana. I felt high in any way, shape, or form. Instead, I felt sick instead. Even the smell of marijuana, it's got that musky, nauseating smell to it. And I just have to, I don't know, it reminds me of the time when, it reminds me of a documentary I read about cigarettes, man. You know, the documentary stated that back then back in the days in the United States, people didn't smoke cigarettes as much, right? Especially women. Women avoided cigarettes like the plague because, it just wasn't what back then cigarettes, even though it wasn't really banned, it wasn't a banned substance. It just wasn't something people did, like they do it today. It wasn't as popular as it was today until a millionaire and billionaire came and bought a cigarette company. The cigarette company was already failing, but he bought it, and then you know what he did? He started marketing it as a as a health drug. He started marketing cigarette as a health drug. He started marketing cigarettes to women as well, telling women that cigarettes are good for you. So, the only reason why you're not smoking cigarettes is because men are bringing you guys down. Men are bringing women down but not allowing them to smoke. Cigarette is a form of, it's a form of empowerment for women. Smoking cigarettes, empowers women. He created so many ads. He always had a product placement of cigarettes and in celebrity ads. Movies always had it in. He spent millions of dollars promoting cigarettes for years until the whole cigarette fad caught on, and then everybody just started smoking cigarettes from it. And he started making billions from it. It turned cigarette that didn't have any benefit whatsoever into something that was that was healthy for you, just through marketing and through lies, through manipulation. He created false studies, fake studies, using scientists, getting the approval of scientists, paying scientists to approve his fake studies. He created fake studies and tricked the United States into thinking cigarettes was some sort of healthy, a health drug. That's why cigarettes are so popular today, because there were billionaires and millionaires back in the day that, bought these, defunct cigarette companies and manipulated the masses into thinking that this thing was a health, there was some sort of health drug. I think that's what's happening with weed today too. Back in the days, weed was bad for you, and it still is bad for you. But now, you hear all the time in the news, you hear people always saying, "Oh no, this is a health drug." This is exactly what they did with cigarettes, man. Back in the days, it was only recently, during the last decade or two, during the last few decades that cigarettes, cigarettes were starting, that people started taking cigarettes seriously as a real, health hazard, you know. But back in the days when we didn't know much about cigarettes, before it became as popular, it was once seen as a health drug, just like weed is right now. Many people who smoke weed to tell you, "Oh, this is healthy for you. It gets me high. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel relaxed. It relaxes me. It helps me do this. It helps me do that." They did it with vaping as well. But there's so many studies that have come out that show that vaping is so bad for you, man. It's even worse than smoking cigarettes, man. It's far worse than smoking cigarettes. And cigarettes is already so bad for you that your body doesn't heal. I've seen research studies that show that your body doesn't heal while you're smoking cigarettes. Your body will not heal from an injury while you're smoking cigarettes. That's how harmful that thing is for you. And now vaping is on a whole nother level. I've been around people who vape, man, and I have to tell you, it's definitely far worse, because the thing kicks in. The feeling of anxiety and stress and pain kicks in far faster when I inhale the what do you call it? The secondhand smoke of someone who vapes versus someone who smokes cigarettes, man. Someone who smokes cigarettes, as long as you leave quickly enough, it doesn't hurt you as much. But someone who vapes and the secondhand smoke from that thing, man, just a small, just inhaling it once, the rest of your day, you suffer from anxiety and stress the rest of the day. Your heart rate just increases for the rest of the day. That's how I felt. I was around someone who's vape, man, for like an event. Man. We had an event, during Christmas, and I went there, and just smelling that thing for just a few seconds that he smoked, he smoked it, man. That thing had me for the rest of the day suffering jitters. That's how badly that thing is, man. Vaping is definitely 10 times worse than just smoking cigarettes. And they tell you there's so many, you get high, you get this. I don't feel any high from it, man. I've never felt any high from any alcohol, any drugs that I've ever taken. I don't know where they're getting this high from, but I think it's the high they get. I think it's the same high you get from self harm. There are people that when they're extremely depressed, they start cutting themselves, and they tell you they get, they tell you they get high from it. I think it's the same thing here. Is the people that tell you they get high from doing drugs are the same people telling you, the same type of people who tell you they get high from cutting themselves. You know, when they start cutting themselves, that pain, that extreme pain they get from cutting themselves, it's it's some sort of high. But I have to tell you the truth, man. If you're not a masochist, you get no high from these drugs, man. There's no feeling of pleasure from these drugs whatsoever. Only someone who likes feeling pain, who likes the body suffering extreme pain, will say pain is pleasure, because there's no way your body will give you any sort of pleasure from pain, from things that harm you. You know, it's almost impossible for your body to give you any pleasure senses. Any feeling of pleasure when you're doing something that physically hurts your body. It doesn't make sense that if you cut yourself, you start feeling pleasure. Doesn't make any logical sense. Obviously, it doesn't. That's exactly the same thing with people that are smoking marijuana, doing drugs, is that, or drinking alcohol, or doing meth, or doing cocaine, or doing all these hard drugs, is that they're not doing it because there's some sort of high. There's no high there. They're doing it because they're doing this. The reason they're doing it is the same reason why someone who cuts themselves does it. It's a form of self harm. You know, there's no real pleasure for a normal person doing it. They will not experience a single ounce of pleasure from it whatsoever. There's just a select few of people that, when they're so depressed, they use this painful substances, as a distraction. When they're already at the suicidal level of depression, man, any sort of pain may could help them. It could distract them from the depression. So I feel like the only people who gets high from these stupid drugs, man, the only people who supposedly get high from these drugs are those people, are the masochists. The people who like harming themselves as a way to distract themselves from the pain, from the depression of regular everyday life, because there's no way these drugs have ever gotten me any, you get no pleasure from something that harms your body, man. How can you gain pleasure? How can your body give you pleasure for something that, causes brain damage, for something that causes organ failure? Why would your body give you pleasure for something that kills you? The human body doesn't give you pleasure for things that harm you. It only gives you pleasure for things that help you. The feeling of pleasure only comes from things that help you. It never comes from things that harm you. And none of these substances, none of these banned substances, none of these drugs have ever had any positive effect on the human body whatsoever. But the only reason why you keep hearing people saying this, it has positive effects, is because there are businesses behind the scenes that have a lot of money invested in these companies, man. There are businesses behind the scenes that that are constantly marketing to you, telling you that these drugs, these drugs give you pleasure. These drugs give you this. These drugs give you that, to trick you into doing them. Then when you start doing them, you realize it doesn't do anything at all, or maybe there's that group of people who realize this drug doesn't do anything at all, and they quit doing it. Then there's the other group of people that have been so manipulated by these companies, they start falling for the placebo that this drug actually does something for them. There's a lot of placebo effect going on with this, with these companies, man. When you've been gaslit so much by these companies, they've tricked you so much. They spent so much money on ad campaigns telling you that these drugs are somehow beneficial for you. These drugs are somehow, they help you realize, they help you this, they help you do that, that you actually start believing them. You believe them so much that when you do these drugs, that they seem to have an effect. But the truth is, the effect is placebo. It's not real. There's no real effect going on. Your mind is tricking you to thinking there's something going on, but there isn't. That's what we have to watch out for. Are these, there's proof all over history of, people with a lot of money, or people, all, with money buying these companies, these drug companies, and then start creating fake studies to prove that these drugs help people in some way or form. When the truth is, these are just people. These are just manipulative businesses that are trying to make money, and they're trying to draw customers to their business. And the only way they can draw customers to their business is using false studies and lies and manipulation and trickery. That's the only way they can make money from these drugs, is tricking you to thinking that it somehow helps you in some way or form. And if you believe them, you start doing them, sooner or later it catches on, and you get addicted to it. But sometimes some of these addictions may not really be real addictions. It's more like habits. For example, if you make a habit of using a fidget spinner, right? The longer you use a fidget spinner, the harder it is for you to stop using it. If you make a habit of going for a walk every single day, the longer you go for a walk, right? The harder, the longer you go for a walk every single day. If you go for a walk every single day for 2 years or 3 years, right? By the third year, it's almost impossible for you to stop going for walks, because you've gotten so used to it. It's become a habit, that your body has been so used to going for walks every day that you start to feel sick if you don't go for a walk, or no, if you don't go for a walk, in the morning, if you don't go for a walk every single day. So you have to think about, some of these addicts aren't real addicts. They're just, people who smoke drugs for so long that it's become a habit for them. Habits are very hard to forget. Habits are very hard to stop. If you make a habit of doing drugs, it's only a matter of time before your body gets used to that, cycle of doing drugs every day or every 2 days, or, multiple times a day, that it makes it very hard for you to stop. It's not that the drug is addictive. It's that the habits are hard. Is that habits are very, very hard to break. So if you make doing drugs a habit, it'll become very hard for you in the future to break it. The moment you make anything a habit for you, the longer you do it, the harder it is for your body. The harder it is for you to program your body to stop doing it. Your body will start to feel sick. You'll start to get, all the withdrawal symptoms you get from doing drugs. You get that too from stopping the habit. So that's what you have to watch out for, is that some of these drugs aren't addictive whatsoever. Is that because people are doing it all the time, they've made it a habit of doing these drugs. Because they made it a habit of doing these drugs, it's very hard to stop doing them, because it's not part of their daily life. Their mind has been hardwired to just do it over and over and over and over again. So you have to really be careful about that as well. Is that some things aren't addictive. It's just habits are in and of themselves addictive after a while. So that's really what I have to say. But I'll think about something else, in the future. But habits die hard. Habits die hard. So do not be gaslit into thinking that these drugs are some sort of cure all. People won't be committing suicide while on drugs, if drugs are some sort of blissful, great experience for you. This world is filled with so much violence, murder. There's even proof that there's so many studies that show that people who are on drugs are actually more violent than everybody else. So obviously these drugs aren't helping anybody for any reason whatsoever. The people telling you that weed is somehow more beneficial than cigarettes, these guys are lying for you, man. These guys, this is sponsored advice from from big corporations behind these drugs, man. That advice is a sponsored advice from from a big corporation. There's these drugs do not have any benefit whatsoever. Do not be tricked into doing drugs. You won't get what you want. Drug addicts have always been shown to be more violent than everybody else. Drug addicts, which makes sense. If you're not someone who does drugs, and you start smelling the drugs, cigarettes, you start smelling weed, your body goes into like a more anxious state, man. People who are more anxious are more prone to violence by default. People are more anxious. People are more, people that is always in a sick, the body's always in a sick state. Your mind is always in an anxious and depressed and sick state. It's only natural for them to be, more volatile, than everybody else that have a more calm, relaxed body, and these drugs always put you in a more anxious state, in a more anxious mood. They rarely ever, relax you in any way, shape, or form. So it's only natural that people who do drugs are more violent than the rest of us because, are more, cantankerous than the rest of us because these drugs aren't helping them in any way, shape, or form. If the drugs are harming your physical body, if the drugs lead to brain damage, if the drugs lead to organ failure, liver failure, lung failure, if these drugs lead to these, outcomes, death, how do you think, your body will feel doing them? Do you think your body will be relaxed, will be happy? It will ever make you feel good in any way, shape, or form? Obviously not. These drugs are, just placebo effects. If you believe these drugs do something to you, you're just lying to yourself. Someone told you they do something, you believe them. And not because you believe them, you're thinking that they're doing something to you. But the only thing they're doing is killing you. That's the only thing they're actually doing for your body. The moment you realize that, you're living in a placebo world where these drugs, you've been tricked into thinking these drugs help you. And because you've been tricked into thinking these drugs help you, you start to see effects that aren't there. Like someone who believes in ghosts. If someone who believes in ghosts are aliens, if someone who believes in aliens, sees a plane in the sky, they immediately think it's an alien, flying. If they see a random cloud in the sky, they immediately think it's an alien. Someone who believes in ghosts hearing random sound, immediately think it's a ghost. So it's all your mind games that you're playing with yourself. And someone who believes that these drugs do something for you, they smoke it and they start feeling things that aren't there, while their bodies dies on the inside. So I really have to be careful of this. I'm someone who can, it's hard for you to really manipulate me. I'm not someone that can be easily manipulated by these things. So it's harder for me to actually feel anything from these drugs because no matter how much someone has told me this does that, I'd rather see the effect first before I believe you. And every time they've told me this does this, this drug does that, when I smell that secondhand smoke and I feel nothing but pain and anxiety, I realize you're just gaslighting me, man. I'm someone who rarely ever believes, what someone tells me to begin with. And when I see the results, and the result is the equal and opposite of what you tell me, it's hard for me to actually believe you're telling the truth, And this has happened my entire life. I'm not someone that stays away from, I stay away from people that do drugs by default anyways, but when growing up, there are places that you just can't stay away from drug addicts, work, school, there's so many places, public events, you just can't stay for people that do drugs, So just from that cursory experience, I just know this is not really, the whole drug scene is filled with lies, There's too many lies going on behind the scenes, too much manipulation to buy drugs from companies that have stockpiles of them and they have nothing to do with them, but they have all these drugs, all these cigarettes, all this weed, all this alcohol, and they have no one to sell it to. So obviously they'll start tricking you into thinking these things are actually healthy for you. They'll start tricking you to thinking these things are healthy for you, just so they can, sell their bags filled with, useless stock that no one wants, And that's how this whole thing goes, man. You get tricked into buying drugs and you buy them, then you get sick and you die. And that's how life works, And they always have their token scientists hidden behind the scene that'll approve any study they want to approve. There's so many studies that back in the days that told you that marijuana, no, that cigarettes was one of the best things in the world, man. Cigarettes can heal you. Cigarettes can change your life. Cigarettes can get you a good girlfriend. Cigarettes can make your life blissful. Cigarettes can give you, a happy life. Cigarettes can give you the American dream. There's all these ads about cigarettes being so good for you. And now what? After decades of studies that constantly prove that cigarettes are bad for you, they can't just keep saying the same thing anymore now, right? Of course not. There's still a few people still saying it, but the majority of people already know that cigarettes are bad for you. But now they're doing the same thing for weed. Now the same people, or the same type of people that were once marketing cigarettes as, oh, the best thing in life, the best thing is sliced bread. This is the greatest thing alive, are not doing the same thing for weed. Now people are constantly telling you, oh, this is the greatest thing alive. Weed is so medicinal. Weed is this. Weed is that. What is this? They'll gaslight you into thinking these things are actually healthy for you. And then after decades upon decades later of endless studies that prove it's bad for you, that's when they'll start regulating it again. But until then, they'll keep making their money, tricking you into thinking these things are good for you. And after they're done with weed, they'll go next to meth, and then they'll try cocaine, and they'll try the other hard drugs. They just keep jumping from drugs to drugs, tricking you into thinking this is medicinal, this and is this and is that. This will help you get a girlfriend. This will help you get a wife. This will help you get a husband. This and this is what you need to correct your mind. This is how you get the best things in life, man. Smoking weed will give you everything you want in life, man. Drinking alcohol will get you all the friends you want. You want friends? Drink alcohol. You want a girlfriend? Drink alcohol. You want a boyfriend? Drink alcohol. You want to love your parents? Drink alcohol. There's always these lies going on about how good these drugs are. So you really have to be careful, in life. Do not listen to these guys trick you into doing drugs. It doesn't do anything for you. These things are harmful chemicals. They've always been harmful chemicals. It didn't change in the past. It's not going to change now. But that's it for today's podcast. I'll talk to you guys later.